Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. I'm your host, Ilana Levin, and this is a comics podcast, or at least a comics podcast that talks about comics shows on occasion. You know, when I last covered X-Men 97 on this podcast, it was in conversation with my dear friend, Stephen Atwell, and we talked about our plans on air for how we wanted to cover the rest of the series. We both loved the show and had so much energy we wanted to spend on it. But as you may have heard, Stephen died from cancer in early April. His absence is an immeasurable loss, not to just his friends and loved ones, but to fandom as well. I've struggled with the question of how I can or should cover the series without him. It took me a while to catch up on the series after his death and memorial, because every time I watched it, there were countless moments that made me wonder what he would have thought or felt about a particular scene or interaction. Would the series meet his hopes that we'd get to see Nightcrawler be something other than, quote-unquote, sad and Catholic? How would Magneto respond when humanity inevitably lets him down? There are endless questions that I would have asked him. One of the ways we're memorializing him is by having my guests for the next 2 episodes of the series be highly qualified X-Men experts who aren't just friends of mine, but who are also friends of Stephen's. If you haven't listened to my episode with Stephen about episode 1 and 2 of X-Men 97 now, this is the time to go and listen to them. The opening is spoiler-free, so it'll let you know all about how and why you might want to watch the show. And he is absolutely brilliant on the episode. He was never anything less than that. Joining me today to talk about the middle series of X-Men 97, episodes 3 through 7, is Sarah Daniel Rasher. Sarah is the co-host of Deep Space Dive, a graphic policy radio podcast about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. A former professor of Shakespeareology, Sarah Daniel is co-director of an education consulting firm that helps schools, universities, and nonprofits use data for education justice. Off the clock, they write about pop culture and niche sports on the internet, try to keep track of all their TTRPG characters, and complain about being behind on comics. Welcome back, Sarah.
Hi, thanks. I'm excited to be here, and flattered to be perhaps inaccurately touted as an expert on the X-Men, but I shall do my best.
Well, it's certainly one of the first things I think we ever spoke about back in college. Folks might know Sarah from, our DS9 work together, but yeah, we've gone far back on the X-Men as well today. This episode is going to be, because we are recording this after the full series has been out, I cannot guarantee that there won't be spoilers of stuff that happens near the end of the season. Our focus will be on mid-season, but there might be some spoilers for the end of the season.
Just to be clear, we're going to focus on episodes 3 through 6.
Yes.
So it's sort of all of the middle stuff and the shorter arcs before that final sort of 4-episode push at the end.
Yeah. There's so many things happening in the text. I was sort of debating where to begin.
X-Men 97 makes connections to a wide range of political and ethical questions raised by the classic X-Men comics that it draws on. So, of course, we're going to start with the most important topic on everybody's mind, the Logan, Jean Grey, Scott, Madeline love triangle, parallelogram. Can we get Morph in there somehow? So, yes. What are your thoughts on this, Ilana?
It's a pentagon. I think it's a pentagon. I have always said that I think one of the interesting things about those characters is the messy drama. And I'm not looking for stories that'll give me a clear and easy answer to who should be with who, as if that is a finite question with a finite answer. So I'm all here for the way the series has gone to lean into the messy. And, as I mentioned with Stephen in the first episode, one of the things that bothered me about the original series was how much it felt like there was just constantly Logan crying out, Jean, and being unrequited, and how that felt really pathetic in a way that I didn't find compelling. And it wasn't until I read comics later that I was like, oh, no, they actually do have vibes with each other. He isn't just completely delusional. And I appreciated that this show sort of touched on the complexity of that, as well as the emotional level that they pitch Wolverine at, where he has concluded that he and Jean are not going to happen, and he is not going to prioritize, like he's putting the good of the group ahead of his own immediate wants. And he's doing it in a way that may or may not be the usual self-flagellating, self-sacrificing kind of thing. Maybe he actually shouldn't be doing it, but it makes sense. And God knows, like, I feel for Scott, and I like that the show gives me space to feel for Scott. He didn't choose to like live with a clone of his wife unbeknownstly for an unknown amount of time, expecting him to be able to just completely cut off his emotion towards that person. That would kind of be psycho too, right?
Right. And one of the things that really stood out to me in this middle set of episodes is that you really, really see in a couple of scenes this really crackling chemistry between Jean and Logan that makes you understand that both of them have made very adult decisions about not being together and not pursuing anything. But at the same time, like, you put them together and the way she feels for him is very different from the way she feels for Scott. And I think it's sometimes really hard to depict that somebody can, first of all, love two different people and to experience those two very intense emotional relationships in very different ways that almost make it feel like the entire sort of monogamous structure of society is a little unfair, because she should be able to have both of those sets of feelings. But like, there's no way for that to exist. Like, even if it could exist, like, you know, within the safe confines of the X mansion, like, Scott would never allow it. So
I don't know, man. I don't know if this Scott would never allow it.
I mean, in the very recent Krakoan age of the comics, he is definitely in a throuple with Logan and Jean.
The mouse would never allow it, but I don't know if this Scott would never allow it. This Scott keeps surprising me with, he does fucked up things and then addresses them. And I'll be talking a lot more about that when we cover the end of the series with my final series guest later. But, you know, you mentioned, we're talking about a pentagon, but in fact, when Jean is talking about the decision she made about like who her commitment is to, it's not even just Logan versus Scott. It's also Logan versus the galaxy is calling to me. So technically it's a septagon?
Hexagon.
Thank you. So technically it's a hexagon, a love hexagon, because space is also one of the potential entities for Jean Grey's affection. I was impressed at how adult it was that the show was willing to show a glimpse of the psychic affair with Madeline, and also that it let the characters like get past it too. I mean, a lot happens really quickly, so you kind of have to.
But I think this is going to come up again and again, that this show is absolutely packed. The amount of stuff that happens in like 28 minutes is incredible. So like, they are covering an incredible amount of emotional ground, and you're watching characters really go through it. And so I think they pull it off to an amazing extent and really sell it. Certainly more than I think I've seen in any other like screen depiction of the X-Men. I think the comics sometimes got there in their best moments. But it is a really hard balancing act to get the audience to see the complexity of the polygon. And, at the same time, as much as shippers are going to ship to some extent, not give you permission to side too strongly with any single pairing within it.
Yeah, I always have said, I ship the characters with drama. That is who I ship them with. I do also want to talk for sure about Morph, as the other piece of the pentangle, the hexagram. I have been doing some rewatching of the original series, which I actually hadn't planned on doing, and has been refreshingly like, oh yes, this animation is fucking heinous, but it is a very well made show otherwise. And like Wolverine and Morph in the original series are best friends, and he goes to great lengths to track down and support Morph when Morph is in crisis. So it felt nice to go and see these characters. This is not a new friendship for them to care about each other. And yeah, like from just watching episode 1 and 2, before there even was a shower scene, Steven and I were both like, so they have a vibe. It's complicated by the fact that in episode 3, I never thought that we would get something as explicitly sexually suggestive as the shower moment that we got, including Morph popping claws and asking Logan if he needs help reaching those difficult to reach places. I'm like, that's extremely phallic. And that man is supposed to be naked over there. I was actually kind of shocked. But of course, like, it's actually horror. And I'm like, oh, that's how you know this is an 80s, 90s thing. It's because the queer sex thing is actually part of a horror plot. Thank you, Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I'm really enjoying Morph's character, actually. But it is a little bit noteworthy that they're kind of we know that the series is not going to let Wolverine, the flagship manly man character, be in a queer relationship. Even though Wolverine is so very, very bi, it's not even funny. And
we're definitely not going to see him in the shower with Nightcrawler either, even though.
I mean, yeah, Morph is kind of being the Nightcrawler in this, I mean,
absolutely.
Really, right?
Yeah. And Morph could be Nightcrawler if they wanted, and could be Jean, and could be Scott, and
could be anybody.
Was Jean at one was like technically Madeline, but nobody knew that at the moment. But like an exaggerated pregnant Madeline at one point.
Yes. Sorry. Just to finish, but sorry, but I was very long, and I know you have a lot to say too. But just to put that, my run of cliff is I'm feeling torn because on the one hand, having Morph feel passionate, be in love at his clearly subtextual friends with benefits, Logan, is, like that's a very real, very believable, we've all been there kind of story. But it is a bit heartbreaking that it's a character who we know IP will never let them be with. And so I really hope that eventually Morph can work through this Logan thing, and they'll pair them off with a character who standards and practices will allow them to go and be queer with.
Which hopefully will not be Bobby, because that's sort of Morph's not a boy. Anyway, but yeah, and I am really, really excited always to see a non-binary character that is set up from the jump as non-binary, that is warmly accepted for who they are by the rest of the found family. Like, that's what you want. But at the same time, I felt really consistently let down. And I'm going to preface this and all future discussion of like, what is the influence of Disney on this, by saying like, I am an unapologetic Disney adult who goes to the parks once a year. And that when we talk about the Disney Corporation's attitude towards queer people, it is really complicated, because on the one hand, in terms of their like on-screen IP, they are very, very cautious. And a lot of that has to do with reselling things to international markets without having to recut them, and also marketing them to parts of the English-speaking world that might not be so welcoming to things that are really, really, really queer. But at the same time, I don't want any listeners to get the impression that we, or especially I, perceive Disney as anything more than very middle of the road in its politics towards queer people, to the extent of like, my wife and I go to the parks, which are the things that actually make the Disney Corporation money. And when we're there spending money there, they are very pro-trans because they want us to buy their merch, and we do. So, with all of that in mind, when we're talking about how Disney has an effect on how certain things are depicted, and one of the first things that does come to mind is Morph, it's like they're doing it as a business decision, not out of any political malice, but making that business decision is in itself a political move. Does that kind of cover a position statement?
Sure.
Because I think that especially on the left, we do get into like sort of condemning business decisions as having conscious political motives that they really don't, when they're really just trying to make money. But again, that's still political. Anyway, I just found myself kind of going like, okay, so we've got another thin, androgynous, white-coated. Can we have a job other than shapeshifter?
I know.
Some of us have been trying for like 40 plus years to shapeshift and keep being 5 feet tall. So so like it's starting to be like there are non-binary tropes that are emerging, and Morph is not doing anything to shake those up. And I feel like the unrequited desire for Logan is something that like you and I pick up on because we're looking, but I also feel like it's really sidelined in comparison to any of the heterosexual relationships on this show. Like it's not, and when it is shown, it's pretty much played for laughs or shown as kind of pathetic. Whereas any opposite sex attraction or any non-queer attraction is portrayed as like a romance that could happen. We get more out of Trish Tilby and Beast than we do out of this.
It feels like they're kind of combining sad gay with comic relief gay. And I'm like, I guess that's two dimensions. It speaks to how good the actor, J.P. Carlack, who is non-binary, their performance is that like, I really do enjoy the character despite kind of having those two extremes of comic relief and sad gay.
Yeah. And I feel like because of the reluctance to take where clearly there is a desire to go, and this does seem to be on the part of some of the writers and some of the production staff. I know, Ilana, that you found out and noted that there are several queer identified members of that writing and production staff. So it seems like there's a real desire to push Morph in a direction. And then like standards and practices showed up and said, yeah, we got to back off of that. And it's really too bad. Like I just felt like there was a lot of missed opportunity in Morph, and that some of it was deliberate, like, you know, the whole thin androgynous white coated thing. Mm-hmm. But also just that there were a lot of things that they might have been told that they had to pull back, but that's still disappointing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But what I also want to talk about with you in particular is, as a fellow non-binary person who was out and queer in the year 1997, but who probably did not use the term non-binary to refer to themselves because it was the year 1997. How do we feel about the use of they, them as one of the pronouns used to refer to Morph in the series that takes place in 97?
I feel like it's an acceptable anachronism because although it was pretty rare to find non-binary people at the time who used they, them, and in fact, people who rejected binary pronouns were more likely to use neopronouns back then, is my recollection. Like, it might have been more like technically realistic to have Morph going around with Z0 or whatever, but having to explain that to a mainstream audience is like a page of text that they don't have time for. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, it's fine. We're close enough. We're getting across what we're getting across. And there's enough other anachronisms and like, don't get me started on the music coordination on this show and things like that. That it's like, that was the least of its problems. And yeah, I think that, if this show were focused on like Morph as a main character, as a young person coming to terms with their non-binary identity and what that means for them, you know, in the late 90s, as you and I both did in our various ways at our various speeds, that, yeah, like there would have been time to go into that. But at the same time, I'm looking more at like, is that how a non-binary person who probably wouldn't have used the word non-binary for themselves, probably would have used like genderqueer or something. That's what I used when I was brave enough to at the time. Was like, does this look like somebody who would have been read in those terms at that time? And I'm kind of looking at it and going, yeah, close enough. Like, that's not my problem.
Yeah, I feel like the amount of work it would take to, you're right. If Morph was the main character, they could handle it otherwise, but because Morph isn't, they can't. And I think that it is actually cool to have them be using they, them in this story and not comment on it. Like, I think that's fine. I want listeners to understand, like, sadly, that wasn't realistic to how shit was, but like, it's the X-Men. So, you know, hey.
And it does create enough of a distance between what Morph as a young person living in the late 90s would have been experiencing versus what somebody of a similar gender identity and presentation would be experiencing now. Like, it's removed enough to be effective, I think. And it's also sort of acknowledging, like, in my own mind, I'm always going to be picking out my favorite characters and either complaining that they're not there or wishing that they were the center of attention, while acknowledging that any mainstream X-Men thing is going to be the Scott, Jean, and Wolverine show.
Which is why I'm so happy for you that we had a lot of Beast, which we'll get to in a moment.
And a reasonable amount of Nightcrawler. And I feel like this does segue too into, like, Morph is the queer character, and there are a lot of other queer figures in X-Men that have been established as queer for some amount of time that there are just conveniently not there. Like there's a big Bobby. There is a big Bobby Drake shaped hole in this season.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people have literally, like, writing staff from the show has been like, yeah, Bobby was the ice cream seller in Genosha. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, that
does not count.
No. I'm like, I don't think that's true. Like, that's Bobby's in the utopian ideal moment where work is no longer has to happen. That would not be Bobby's job, nor is that Bobby's job in a world where work does have to happen. There's no world in which Bobby is the ice cream vendor.
If Bobby is living in Genosha, he has a very successful accounting business.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. But like, there's no Mystique, and there's there's Mystique in like every other.
Well, there's probably no Mystique. You never know. No, I definitely, I definitely do think that Val Cooper is Val Cooper, but like, we don't know.
We really don't know. And there's no Kitty Pryde.
Nope. Well, God forbid they won't even let fucking Kitty Pryde be bi for more than 2 panels in the comics. So.
Well, she's bi in our hearts.
She's bi in the mind of the people who created her and in everyone who cares about the character. But yeah, like, I really do hope that, like, there really needs to be more. There was literally a flash and you'll miss it image of, interestingly enough, Boom Boom and Cypher, a character, not Cypher Doug Ramsey, but a different character called Cypher, who is a butch black woman with dreads who looks awesome, dancing together in like a quick moment in Genosha. And that was blink and you miss it. So, I mean, I want to be clear, folks, though. I mean, look, like, Magneto, Professor X are extremely gay with each other. We will be spending a lot of time in my episode 3 talking about that, because most of that particular romance is contained in those episodes. But we're not saying that there's nothing else happening, but we would like to see. I am glad that we have what we have, and I hope for more. And I guess I'm kind of a broken record in that that's always what I seem to say, but yeah.
X-Men 97 Season 2 have the courage to bring on Kitty Pryde as a love interest for Morph and make her bisexuality part of the reason why it's working.
Yes.
That's all I'm saying. Like, so it's like there, and it's like, again, it's going back to my whole long Disney table setting. Like, I understand why there was a need to be cautious in season 1 of this show. But at the same time, I think that you and I, as 2 queer fans, can get on here and say, give us more.
Speaking of visible mutants, and people who are having kind of a different moment, you know, it's been a rough time for Beast in the comics. So I feel like you have been very excited about him.
Feelings about Beast's rough time in the comics than a lot of people do. One of the things that you and I kind of talked about in advance was that sort of at the outset of this show, the only really visible mutants who can't fully hide being mutant are Morph, who can pass with effort, with use of their powers, and Beast, who usually stays back at the lab, because Beast, in addition to being full-time blue and furry in this universe, also, like, wants to get his 2 cents in at all times, which apparently is one of the reasons he is my favorite and nobody else's. So we end up with Hank as the most visibly mutant, as frankly he often is. We get Nightcrawler halfway through the season. I feel like that's a character that they're probably going to expand more on if, God willing, we get a season 2.
Season 2 is being edited right now.
Sweet. Doesn't mean that it won't get, thrown
Zaslav, I know.
Yeah, Zaslaved. But I feel like like what my first note on Beast was, it's refreshing to have a Beast who there's no sign that he's ever going to descend into fascism, and make me cry and stop reading X-Men comics for a couple of years before I could go back knowing that it was permanent and actually read some of that.
Yeah.
And instead has the flaws that Hank always has, because if you cannot deal with arrogant people who know deep down in their heart that they're always right, like, you're not going to like Beast. And I know that there's a definite, really passionate contingent of X-Men fans who are not Hank fans. And some of their reasons are like fat phobia, but some of their reasons are really like, he is an arrogant shit, and he is an arrogant shit. And,
well, I mean, a lot of people read him as being like the, a self-hating mutant in respectability politics, and that gets ascribed to him a lot now.
Yeah, which I again, on the list of like things that I don't really see in the text and that I think are kind of confusing to me, because he's the one that's out there having to be blue and furry every day. It's a lot harder to love yourself when people see a murder Muppet and cross the street. Like,
yeah.
And I feel like there's a really strong parallel there to being a visible, non-passing queer person. Like, it's a lot harder to love yourself when like people are on the daily reinforcing your dysphoria. So like, yeah, again, like I understand and reject most people's reasons for disliking him. But at the same time, his personality is off-putting in many of the same ways that my personality is off-putting. So,
yeah, no, I'm very much like, I see all the sides in this, and I'm excited that we're going to get to see something different. And like, before people go and take this to be like, oh, so you're saying Beast? I'm like, no, like, oh my God, Beast really needs help with his bedside manner. When you tell somebody that they're a clone, please pull them aside in private first. But for narrative economy, the show is, of course, going to just have it be done this way. There isn't time for him to do it otherwise.
But it's also like the fact that you have a character who is going to be so blunt and so certain of his conclusions that he's just going to deliver things that way. It is very narratively efficient. And it's also an interesting personality trait when he's surrounded by people who don't share it. Which is one of the reasons why Hank has always kind of been my guy. And at the same time, you get all the things that are really fun about him, where, like the number of times where in my notes for this podcast, I just wrote Hank put on some pants, Hank an open lab coat with your fully furry body and nothing on but a pair of underoos is not lab safe. Like,
no, it's really not lab safe.
He's funny. He gets a lot of really good one-liners. The number of times he says, oh my, at the exact right moment, like there's a good half dozen. But at the same time, there is a sense that it's like, there's a potential to take him in direction. And I feel like because of the warmth that he's been set up with, and hey, he gets to see Trish in like episode 4. It gets to establish early on that he does have an emotional and romantic life, and that there are people out there that are capable of perceiving him in that way too. Trish Tilby, one of comics' great monster fuckers. God bless her. But at the same time, like one of the things I love about X-Men is that there are very few truly evil mutants of any lasting, there's some, but most of them either have a really good reason for doing the destructive things they're doing, or they're of the like Magneto, Emma Frost, Mystique kind of vein where they are capable of being very heroic. They are capable of being very villainous. And one of the main points and one of the main theses of the X-Men is that your biology is not your destiny. And what makes you good or bad is your choices, not whether you're like normal or a monster. And so the idea that all of the things that converge in Hank, both from that like being an arrogant know-it-all and being one of the most visibly mutant mutants that we get to know, and having, despite his appearance, a whole lot of like affluent white cis straight male privilege that he's internalized and never reversed. Like the thing that's really poignant to me about the comics arc, which is a very, very slow burn that you almost don't really notice until things get really bad, is that Hank is exactly the kind of guy of a certain generation and background that does go from occasionally saying things you wish he wouldn't say to like full-blown MAGA, like so fast you did not see it coming. And having had one person in particular in my life who I cared about very much, like having had that firsthand experience of seeing somebody who I think, like, in his way, like there is still love there, but like went way down that rabbit hole. Like it was very believable to see the Hank of the comics go there. And the idea of somebody having the potential for horrific evil within him is really powerful to me. And so it's like, I wouldn't mind if the show went there too, but at the same time, like being able to like latch onto him and being given quite a lot of him and having a really good voice performance behind him. That made me really happy as a Beast fan.
Yeah. And also, and the other thing with X-Men also is those villains are often have moments where they're right? Like that's got that complexity there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a bit more about Inferno. I never thought that they would do an entire Inferno in one episode. And yet there we had it.
It's half an episode. Like,
yeah. Like it's insane. Folks probably are aware by this point. Although maybe we have some new listeners who only are listening to this for X-Men 97. I'm kind of a big Daredevil fan. And my husband's familiarity with comics, other than Punisher and Lone Wolf and Cub, is to an extent vicarious through me. And he was like, wait, that was Inferno? Where's Daredevil? I'm like, no, Daredevil is only a major Inferno thing if you're me. Yes. Or Sarah, who are obsessed with with Daredevil's Inferno storyline. That's actually an X-Men crossover. It's such an X-Men crossover that Kingpin's assistant apologizes to him for having him be stuck in an X-Men crossover. Anyway, we do get, of course, a lovely little Daredevil cameo of Daredevil getting his ass kicked as nature intends, happening later in the series. But, if you're going to have Inferno and have it really quickly, like I was amazed at how much they were able to successfully pull that off. And like in that short of a period of time.
Like, of course, I wanted more because Inferno is one of my favorite arcs ever. And like, I just wanted, 3 episodes of like trippy demons and like traffic cones turning into monsters and swallowing children and spitting them out in a hell dimension later and all that stuff. But like, I also liked the economy that they used and the way that they used it. And they used it as just sort of like, we're going to have it be a nightmare for like 10 minutes and then we're going to move on from it.
And I also want to say, like, when this went horror quickly, I love having Roberto and Jubilee watching the horror movie together, being, like teens of the period, and then having the horror movie break through the third wall and go and eat them. And, what's interesting is everybody's like, oh, Poltergeist or, oh, Nightmare on Elm Street. But there's actually, yes, that's true. But also there are some deeper cut horror movies happening in those scenes. There is a scene, like the screen that's straight out of Demons 2, which is like obscure. But I'll link to the link in the comments if you don't believe me. But like, that's fucking from Demons 2.
And also Videodrome.
When you have Rogue and Magneto making out and becoming a gross body pile together, that's from Society, which is a horror movie that I highly endorse. You got the elevator door opening thing. You got that from The Shining, and then it opens up and you have the fucking Miyazaki head. Beast's reply, sorry, wrong floor, is truly amazing.
It was my favorite moment from that episode.
Oh my God, of course.
And because he's the one seeing right through the horror. He's like, that is less scary than me. Let us move on.
That's so true, though. No, he figures it out fast. the thing, like when that monster from the TV comes and flips its head around, its body shape and posture is the thicking thing from the thing that crawls along the ceiling when they bust out of the, right? So they're drawing from a lot of different period horror movies, not just the couple that get mentioned by other people. You heard it here first.
One of the other things that stood out about Madeline Pryor's arc was this sense of like her asserting her personhood, despite the idea that, well, you are a clone and you are in fact proprietary and you belong to me. And that just really struck me as a like, in our current sort of, AI generated hellscape, like especially in a show that is like several layers deep of IP. There's some irony there, but it's also really effective.
Yeah, totally. No, and I like the way they're addressing Sinister politically in the series, talking about basically harvesting, appropriating like mutant genetics. I'll also say like I like that the show was able to pivot tone that quickly and bring it in and bring it back.
Similarly in terms of like packing in references very quickly, I want to note the Motendo again, like in and out in 15 minutes story, which it has some deeper resonances that I would love to hear you get into.
Yeah.
But that is also my wife, Amy, in her words, played the shit out of the Sega Genesis X-Men game as a kid and played a lot of like 90s and early aughts X-Men games. And when we watched that episode for the second time, was just every 5 seconds saying, okay, that's from that game and that's from that game. And, and I am much less versed in them, but have played some. And I was like picking up score cues from various, like 90s video game soundtracks.
Yeah.
Like I do not have the reference list that you have for this one, but,
they were like even punched out and this one I get it, Frank, was like they punched out the fucking cars you're supposed to punch in Street Fighter. I was like, oh yeah.
It was just absolutely wall to wall packed with 90s video game references, and it's Jumanji, and it's that episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine where Bashir gets old. Like it's not only just more references than one person's brain could possibly take in. It's also incredibly cross-referential just in terms of the sort of sci-fi and comic book narrative tropes that it's picking up and throwing into the blender. And I think that that's incredibly impressive. And it's sort of, we complain a lot about those tropes being ground down until they're no longer meaningful. And it was cool to see them used in a way where they were so shorthanded that there was an assumption that you recognized where they were being pulled from. But at the same time, they were given just enough breathing room so that you could realize that it was intentional and that everything was being placed. And I feel like that was true of both Inferno and of Motendo. And it's one of the things that overall, also in a lot of like the cameos and the Easter eggs, and we'll probably get into that either in a minute or later on. But like one of the things that's really masterful about this show is its use of reference in a way where it's incredibly rewarding if you get it. But even if you are completely new to all of this and miss every single reference, you're still going to enjoy it and get a lot of it.
I mean, and what I liked about the Motendo one is this isn't fucking some Ready Player One bullshit. Like it's actually saying like, no, don't do that. Like you can't live life as just trying to recycle these moments from the past because it's safe and repeating them. Like the old woman Jubilee is very much giving a talk to the viewers, being like, yes, we know we've made a TV show that is very much grounded in nostalgia, but it can't just be about recycling things that you recognize or have seen before, because that's kind of like its own form of death. And you need to be able to take something from them and move forward with it. And I felt like that's a lesson that fans really do need to learn a lot and often. Anyway, what did you think about the whole body horror, fat, thin, body shit happening with Mojo?
I just thought that Mojo was grotesque in a way that was kind of cool. It's one of those things where it's like, yes, point taken, but I think that the grotesqueness was like that Mojo looked like a giant melting pile of snot, more than anything else. And that this incredibly arrogant, self-absorbed character, was like the most repulsive thing imaginable and seemed to relish that. I thought it was effective. And I think that like sometimes, as much as I'm always going to flag fat phobia, sometimes that's not really the point. And sometimes something is not a particularly meaningful example of it, because Mojo was just gross and unpleasant in a way that I think that even the comics tend to shy away from.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. And obviously he needs to stop killing tech support. I'm so happy to see Spiral. I mean, having those little Spiral moments pleased me greatly. I like Jubilee taking Roberto on like a journey of like coming out, right?
Yeah. And the heavy-handed X-Men coming out allegories are always heavy-handed. And I think you and I are always going to go, oh God, not again. But I think that's because it's you and I watching it. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's there for a reason. No, I think it's good. And I think it's cool to be able to have Jubilee help somebody through that now as a sign of like her maturity, etc. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's meaningful that story takes place on her 18th birthday.
Oh, yes. You know, what I love is, so when Mojo is making his pitch to her for why she should stay on this show, he's like, Summer's Gray divorce court. That's not my X-Men. You're my X-Men, Jubilee. So game on. Like, he's literally calling out fans who complain when any story deviates from the constructions of the characters that they are most attached to. He's like literally saying, if that's your reaction to things changing and developing over time, you're being like Mojo. Don't be like Mojo. Is it life death time?
Yeah. And I felt like Life Death, on the one hand, it is hands down like the best Storm story in the comics. And I was glad that they gave so much time to it. But I was not real satisfied with it.
Oh, do tell.
And one of the things is, and this is sort of, unfortunate convergences, but I was really happy to see Forge. Mm-hmm. And I was really happy to see Indigenous representation where that was discussed and it mattered. But on the other hand, I'm watching this, in the middle of the run of this series. I was at a work conference where the keynote speaker was an educator and activist named Matika Wilbur, who specializes in helping other educators learn about how to present Indigenous experiences and issues to people who might not have experience with them. And I was sort of watching it through that lens. And I was going, if they had a consultant, they probably needed a better one, because it fell into a sort of like all Native Americans have one culture, and it's sort of about riding horses through the wilderness. And it's sort of upholding like American mythologized images of Indigenous Americans rather than exploring the lived experiences of Indigenous Americans now. Just the sight of him repeatedly at a bar drinking was making me go, oh God, maybe not.
One thing I will also say, like, the horses were really well animated. The running on horseback was really well animated. The horror of having Storm have to go through a tunnel that even non-claustrophobic people would not want to fucking go through was like, oh yeah, no. Nobody wants to go through that tunnel, let alone claustrophobic people. Definitely. Yeah. I also kind of like that Forge is using magic, but it isn't like, oh, he's just naturally magic because he's Indigenous. He like is literally like going from a book that he got from his mom. Like, that was always one of the fucking cool things about Forge's powers, is that rather than being like natural shamanistic powers, whatever, it's like, no, he's like a tech guy.
That's the big reason I was so excited to see Forge is he's such a stereotype busting character. And there's so much to be done with him. Again, like remaking the show so that all of my favorites get bigger roles. But like, bring back Forge, give him more to do, you know, because
I also love that his robot leg, even with this robot leg, he uses a cane, is like, yeah, because that's like how prostheses work.
Right. Like, yeah, to varying degrees, everybody's going to have days when they want them. I wanted to see more like weird tech stuff from him, but I also loved that the response and the solution to Storm's condition was not just mystical, but also technological. And just on the narrative tip, unrelated to that, was like life death is supposed to be imagistic and have a very thin veil between what is really happening and what is only happening in Storm's mind. But I felt like the veil was so thin that it wasn't just disorienting. It was like, what happened? Did that actually happen? Who's seeing what now? Like, it just got a little bit muddled.
Do you feel like the episode was implying that she mind over mattered her way back into her powers?
Yeah, there was that too. It wasn't clear how she got her powers back. And you're right. Like, there's like a troubling implication that she just thought good thoughts until she overcame her disability.
I mean, they put it together better than that, but it still left me as a person with a disability that lots of people think I can fix by taking more vitamin D, as if I don't take so much fucking vitamin D already. It was a little bit like, no. But she words it because the writing is good. And God, the actress is fantastic. I mean, she's having the time of her life. She's getting to voice both herself and her nemesis, like evil herself. I mean, like what a show-stopping moment what like an absolute powerhouse moment for Alison Seeley Smith to get to both perform the Storm and Storm's counter Storm, right? Like, wonderful. But like she says, we heal our adversary by embracing it. I don't know. It's sort of an interesting line I'm trying to sit with. And then going right from that exchange to recognize to that at the end of life, death, to seeing like turning on the TV and hearing about the genocide in Genosha and being like, oh fuck. And the news saying that countries are refusing to allow the Genoshan refugees to repatriate. It's just like, whoa.
Which, as has been noted to us on Blue Sky by the wonderful T Berry Blue, that and like sort of expressed, like we were going back and forth, like noting that watching those Genosha sequences in light of current politics, it hits pretty hard. And that to a certain extent, there's a whole other podcast on that. But yeah, it hits real hard when you're seeing lots of civilians getting, indiscriminately bombed on the news, and sometimes discriminately bombed.
Like where they're supposed to be flourishing. And it's so important that we got to see Genosha while people are celebrating and embracing and having mutant culture and living their lives before we see it end. I feel like in the comics, that wasn't really the case as much, although maybe it's just a question of what I had read. Because you have to sort of get a sensation and feeling of this place as being real before you can really accept its destruction. So much of the problems with the way media covers atrocities in the Middle East is it acts as if everything was always fucked there and that everyone was always starving. And one of the things that's been so powerful with the recent ability for people around the world to share their reality through social media is people being like, this is what my apartment looked like before it got destroyed by the IDF. And here's my backyard. And like, we have lives. We like have a house. Like there's this people looking in from the outside, like have a view of people who are going through horrors as being debased themselves in such a way that creates a sense of remove from them. And when you're able to first see people flourishing and living their lives before the atrocity, it brings them closer to you as a witness.
And to be clear, like that's actually been a pattern that I think has arisen just with people's ability to put video and photos of themselves on the internet with more and more ease. Like, I really think of the first conflict that I associate with that kind of like, this is what my house looked like last month. This is what my house looks like now. I think of like Syria, like 10 years ago, as being the first time when we saw that a lot. Mm-hmm. And when I was looking at, especially when it was the news broadcast and they were showing the sequence of images, that I am not an expert in photojournalism, but I definitely recognize some as being sort of framed in imitation of photojournalism, spanning from like the Vietnam War through the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. That like there was a really conscious effort to mimic the now quite extensive history and legacy of photojournalism that reflected the horrific effects of war on everyday people. And then there's been this shift in like the past 10 or 15 years towards those everyday people chronicling the effects of war on themselves. And we've seen it really beautifully illustrated by incredibly courageous people in Syria and definitely in Ukraine to a lesser extent, but it's still, I've seen images of things going on in various parts of Central and East Africa that some of that does get through in Sudan and stuff. So it's widespread, but it's also like, I think at this present moment, we're seeing those parallels really strongly with Gaza in particular. But also, I think that one of the ways that the show is successful is that it makes it possible to map those images and the horror and the trauma of those images onto the news, regardless of which news you're seeing.
One of the things that, one of the things that made it so hard when I saw they were going to Genosha was knowing that we were going to see all this go on, right? Like, I was like, oh, fuck, I'm going to see everyone happy. I'm going to see Mutant Utopia and it's going to get taken away. Also, like the real, the writers mentioned comparing it to the Pulse shootings, the scene, which maybe this being like this paradise destroyed and this violation of like a queer space. And it was like, yeah, that's a really good point of reference for that feeling. And then just having the TV news at the end being like, oh, countries don't want to let Genoshans repatriate to where they were from. I'm like, of course not. Like that the show knows enough to point that out feels very good to me.
And I mean, the other thing really that's standing out to me about Genosha was that arc is in and out in like 2.5 episodes. It is very quick.
Yeah. That's
like
crazy.
It's brewing earlier, but really the story is told very quickly.
And also just like literally having people getting crushed underneath the weight of this giant heroic scale sculptures of Magneto and Charles is like heavy. Seeing all of the Magneto is right because in the comics we had like Magneto was right because he was allegedly dead at the time of that meme getting started and Xavier in the riot at Xavier's storyline. Here he's alive. And so the banners are all like Magneto is right. And, it's an interesting place to be looking at how, and this is the one I'm trying to have it so that, my conversation with Sarah today and my conversation that I'll be having with Ethan at the end of the series is not going to be duplicative. But the one thing that I feel like I definitely am hitting with both of you guys is like, has there ever been a serial story in which the general audience's orientation to who is right and who is wrong has flipped more standardly than this, where like now it's like everybody is like, oh yes, Magneto is the way, versus, a part of that was obviously like the characterization has changed. And please everybody, for the love of God, go read what Stephen Atwell wrote for a people's history of the Marvel Universe. He did a series of essays looking at the evolution of Magneto's character and politics from his creation by Kirby and Lee in the Silver Age of the 60s, all the way through Claremont, changing him into being a Holocaust survivor. Rather than really going into that now, like, go read what Stephen wrote. He fucking said it. But it's I'm sorry, I'm a bit talking into a circle.
Yeah, we are kind of talking ourselves into a circle with this. And I think, I think I got it through Jay and Miles' store. My Magneto made some valid points shirt. That but there is a sense, I think, generationally, that we've moved from the sort of mid-century assimilationist thinking toward feeling like Magneto separatism, if excessive, is at least on the right track in a way that Xavier's assimilationism can never be. So like there's several nods to that. There's a point in, I think it's the Motendo episode where Jubilee flat out says, so Magneto was right. Like there's a lot of nods to that sort of cultural shift.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about Magneto, the ruling council of Genosha? God, it was so much fun to see about our fucking asshole Sebastian Shaw and the wonderful, flawless White Queen going and like recruiting and sniping at people, but going and recruiting Magneto to be chancellor. I love how like no fictional story ever wants to deal with an actual election. Anywho, but how did you feel about their move to have Magneto become chancellor and Magneto's request to Rogue that she should be the co-political leader? And he's not like I think a lot of people would want to read it as he's just trying to get with her, but like I think that's an insult to his intelligence and her intelligence. I think it's deeper than that.
I feel like, and especially, it's the 90s, that the visual and rhetorical parallels to Bill and Hillary Clinton were very, very visible, where it's basically like him flat out saying, like, let's just sell the fact that we're together and this is going to be politically advantageous for both of us because we know our hearts are in the right place and you can literally feel their pain. And I'm like, oh, you're definitely going there.
When you put in the show notes, I feel your pain, I was like, Sarah, you're fucking brilliant. I had not fucking put that connection in. For folks who might be too young to remember, in 1992, Bill Clinton was on the campaign trail, and he's confronted by Bob Rafsky, who is a member of ACT UP, the HIV organization. Rafsky says, and he's actually paraphrasing Vito Russo here, he says, "We're not dying of AIDS as much as we're dying of 11 years of government neglect." Rather than being like, fuck you, shut up, go away, Clinton replies, "I feel your pain," which sounded corny as fuck to me as a very, very young teenager. In that moment, the media responded to very positively. But it became sort of a meme that he then used on other people who spoke to him, who were struggling with the personal impact of systemic cruelty and injustice. The thing is, the phrase and his response definitely worked on a lot of people. People would kind of like joke about it, but also it was clearly working on some of the American public because he was a very gifted communicator, whether or not it might have resonated with the people he directed it at directly. But as for Bob Rafsky, 2 days later, the candidate Clinton met up with members of ACT UP to discuss his AIDS politics, and he agreed to make a major AIDS policy speech, have people with HIV speak at the DNC, which was groundbreaking in 1992. And he signed on to the UAA plan. So yeah, confronting powerful people matters. Also, yeah, that whole framing is very 90s.
Yeah. So I feel like it was very much a moment of politicizing the personal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you look at those 90s and turn of millennium politics, you get all of these examples of formerly persecuted leaders being sort of pushed forward as like the figurehead of, Nelson Mandela as the figurehead of a new South Africa. All of these people where it's like, if Genosha hadn't instantly been bombed into the ground, like, I think that Magneto was already aware that he was gonna be effectively a figurehead. and that they were going to pretend to listen to him. And then that ruling council was going to do whatever they wanted. And that Rogue was his way of shielding himself emotionally from that disappointment of
interesting,
not having any real power there and then being blamed for anything that went wrong.
Oh, that's a really good insight. I sort of took it more as like Rogue, she's a respected ex-person, ex-woman, ex-man, and, someone who both critics and supporters will view as being like a trustworthy and legitimate, co-leader for that.
I saw it as, in contrast to like an episode later, Charles Xavier legitimately thinking that he was going to like reform the entire Shi'ar empire with the power of his like rhetorical skills.
Oh my God.
Magneto does not have that illusion. I think Magneto thinks that he can do something for Genosha, but I think that his conversation with Rogue was really very much like, we need to make this look good and you can make sure that it's going to look good.
I definitely appreciate that a number of people like really talk about politics as theater and how they're presenting themselves to others. And Magneto, like based on like looking at things like use of heroic statue and all kinds of propaganda that's built into how Genosha is set up. Like it is a state that understands that. Another thing with the Rogue Magneto relationship is that in so many series, if there was a female character who was expressing exasperation and sadness over not being able to have sex and was making life decisions of significance because of her inability to do so, everybody, the show would be treating her like she was a dumb bitch, slut, all kinds of, they would be trashing her. And this show actually is like, no, it's legitimate that Rogue wants to be able to have sex, that what she's yearning for is legitimate. It is fucked up that she can't experience those things. And the fact that she can't, experience it with Magneto and can't with Gambit, it doesn't make her a terrible person for considering that as a reason to switch partners. What was really impressive to me was this show showing so much compassion for her and for how hard it is for her to not be able to touch people and how she deserves to experience that. And how, she's not a bad person for wanting to be able to have sex. That's kind of a groundbreaking thing for the show to do, to be honest.
Yeah. And the only time she gets to touch Gambit is when he dies.
Oh,
I love that conflict was taken seriously, and that it was one of several moments where somebody tried to mansplain away a problem, and a woman or person of color looked at that person and said, no, you can't just logic that away. My concerns are real.
That was, to me, actually as jaw-dropping as the handful of queer things that we got. That was jaw-dropping to me.
Yeah.
And her whole conversation with Remy, and he's talking about the performative nature of their dating here, they are both leaning into certain kinds of archetypes, was very a smart way to contextualize what we had seen on screen in the children's cartoon in the past. And acknowledging the hard to describe nature of the relationship as that had been on screen before. Gambit's death, though, he got an amazing fight scene in the lead up to it. He kicked fucking ass in that fight. He really was the gentleman and respectful the whole time. He really availed himself incredibly well. And he, died smartly. He didn't die like a chump. He died made a massive sacrifice in a badass way. So
he did.
Now he'll be back I'm sure he'll be back as Death in Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse story next season or the one after. But yeah, I cried. God, I cried so much. I'm like, was this the first episode I saw after Stephen died? It might be. I was a fucking mess the entire time. Because we knew it was coming.
It's, and I feel like just more the courage of having a significant turning point character death on this show. That was something that they didn't have to be courageous enough to do, but they did. And have it not necessarily be the person you thought. It looked like this was going to be it for Magneto or something, and to have it be Gambit really it was shocking. It was moving. And it was really heroic about a character who personality-wise doesn't always come off being particularly heroic.
Yeah.
One of the things to point out is that Magneto frequently makes the connection between Genosha and the Holocaust. And as a Holocaust survivor himself, I think that he gets a free pass on comparing things to the Holocaust. Because if you have like firsthand experience in something and you say, you know what this reminds me of? This awful traumatic thing that was the worst thing that ever happened to me that I already experienced and saw with my own eyes. And this reminds me of that. Like Magneto gets to say that. So something that almost always bothers me when it's invoked either in media or on the internet, if Magneto does it, I'm almost always cool with it. Like he knows.
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny because, he only knows so much as the writer knows, but I think people are doing an interesting job with it. And I know we'll be talking about this more when we cover the finale for sure. I'm really glad that the show has kept it so that is still part of his story, because even as sliding timescales complicate it, we have so few depictions of this in popular culture. And as Stephen said in our episode together, you have to keep reminding people or else it doesn't stick.
Right, right. And what I've consistently seen with depictions of Magneto, and like there are exceptions out there, but even in things that have problems elsewhere, what I find is like, whenever Magneto invokes the Holocaust in comics or on screen, like even knowing that there is a writer somewhere putting those words in his mouth. And now, as time moves on, those writers do not have firsthand experience of the Holocaust or of World War II. Like it seems to be done so judiciously that I think that something that anybody who's writing Magneto seems to know is Magneto is not going to go comparing things to the Holocaust left and right. He is going to save it for things that actually remind him of his experiences. And writers seem to be very, very good about that, which I think is sort of the real lesson to take away from it is take a step back, look at what you're experiencing. Is this really a valid metaphor? It's probably not, but if it is, like, that's how you restore meaning to it.
Yeah. Yeah. We kind of covered Life, Death 1 and 2. So let's shift over to outer space for a while and join our friends in the farthest reaches. One of the things that struck me when we have the scene of the Shi'ars just kicking the ass of the Kree, who always deserve it, which is hard, of course, because the Shi'ar themselves are, as in the words of Jay and Miles, explain the X-Men bird jerks. So this is definitely one of those, let both those bastards fight it out, is the Kree are an alien race for whom the average MCU viewer has some familiarity with. And so having the Shi'ar show up and beat up the Kree is a good way to explain the severity of the Shi'ar to new audiences who might be unfamiliar with them.
Yeah. And I think that I've seen elsewhere, I can't place it, but like the idea that, you go into cosmic Marvel and outer space Marvel and basically all of the aliens you encounter are jerks.
Yeah.
Like you can just assume that everybody out there is terrible and that it's basically one big space dystopia.
It's also, it's a lot of space. There's lots of like space Romes fighting each other.
Yeah.
It's like that whole meme of like currently thinking about Rome is like an accurate description of so many Marvel writers. Yeah. There definitely are exceptions, but the fact that we have to like actually put work to think about them is kind of like making the point,
And when it works, it's usually because it's sort of displacing that Roman Empire stuff into, hi, this is the Roman Empire, but you know who we're really talking about. Hint, it's either Russia, China, or you, or all of the above.
Those are such big options, General.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that covers the vast majority of the world is kind of the point.
Yeah.
Like, you look at it and you see lots of bird jerks, and the bird jerk is you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Sarah. That's probably going to be a pull quote for this in some way. Very well animated fight scene, as they all are. I love the voice they have for Gladiator. Gladiator was so fun in the original series. I'm glad that they have him, even if it's just a tiny cameo. Also, clearly a character design based on OMAC from Jack Kirby, the one-man Army Corps. And lo and behold, Professor X has faked his death yet again. That's one of his hobbies. And I really like how he is introduced in that scene in his cybernetic body, that exoskeleton basically, that is using to pretend that he can walk, and doing very over the top theatrical statecraft with Lilandra. And that they immediately, go into conversation afterwards about how politics is performance, which is a theme throughout the series.
And I mean, you mentioned just how good that space battle looks. And I feel like this was one of the best looking episodes, and like just the detail in all the aliens. And I think one of the strengths that I know you and Steven talked about, and that I've been thinking about, is that like so much went into recreating the sort of aesthetic of the prior series, but also elevating it and using it as sort of a basis to do art. And I feel like with those fight scenes and with all of the sort of quirky aliens and like the animators did an especially good job here of using that aesthetic as a jumping off point to do all kinds of cool, fun stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, like we all know that Lilandra and Xavier aren't going to work.
Right.
Long term. And, like the fact that what the Shi'ar are asking him to give up is literally his identity in every meaningful way. And they're asking him demanding that he fully assimilate into their culture, or else he can't have a place in theirs. So it's like a micro version of like how they operate as an empire itself. And what I think is also very telling is the moment where Xavier finally decides he can't keep playing along. He can't go along with this like destruction of his identity to marry Lilandra, is when a bird jerk who isn't even Deathbird is like, calls his blood tainted and is attacking him for being a mutant, and is being eugenics about him. I mean, there's so much also just eugenics about like, they can't be allowed to know that he's paralyzed. They can't be allowed to know like how, it's bad if they know how mutants are perceived on Earth, etc. But that ultimately when he's like, no, this is not acceptable, is when they start shitting on his people.
Right.
Like, shit on me all you want, but you can't shit on my people.
And what's interesting to me is like, they are right for the wrongest reasons possible. Like they're right that this is not going to last long term, that Bird Lady and, random guy from the Milky Way, like they are not going to be like the love that unites the Empire. There's a great moment where it's talking about, melding, creating these like half-breed children. And I'm like, first of all, how does that even work? Like, do the Shi'ar lay eggs? But also just like I
think they do, because they talk about hatching.
It reminded me, honestly, just because I just rewatched Harold and Maude for the billionth time, of like the priest talking about her withered flesh. Like, it's the same kind of like, ooh, he's so gross. How can you possibly be into him? And all that stuff. Like, but they're not wrong. Like, she's sort of blinded by infatuation and not really thinking politically. So they're using all of the worst and most disgusting, racist and eugenicist and colonialist arguments to shut this down, which is why they are unsuccessful in convincing her.
Right.
Whereas if they'd sat her down like a good group of friends staging an intervention and saying, we're so happy that you're happy. He really seems great. We haven't seen you like this in a long time, but we really do think that before you bring any significant other into our politics, you need to be together a little bit longer and really understand the parameters of your relationship and its limitations. Like if they'd had that grown-up conversation, it would have gone very differently. But instead, we need to see like all of the worst things about the Shi'ar.
Right. And they couldn't have that grown-up conversation because they really are like eugenics bird jerks, right?
Right.
And the other piece is like, oh my God, how bad for Earth would it be for the Shi'ar to get involved in our little backwater system? It's like, no, thank you. I don't need that.
Please just put the mostly harmless sign back on Earth and leave us alone.
Yeah, exactly. So I was really excited that the show actually went into this part because of the space politics I find compelling. And really, like, for folks who are unfamiliar with the comics, like, the X-Men go to space and deal with space politics a lot. It's not surprising. It's very much one of the genres that Chris Claremont loved. And so he kept bringing it back into the series. And I also just really is like, you know, when Xavier decides he's going to leave and go back to his children, he's also giving up a level of advanced mobility that he has with her. I mean, it's,
but I think there's a level of disability politics in there that I think gets brought up really often by disability activists, that like their disability becomes part of their identity. So this idea that any circumstance that is a quote unquote cure or an improvement, like the idea that you would sacrifice everything else for it, like that's not how many or most disabled people operate. It's how able-bodied people assume disabled people operate. So seeing somebody with a disability say, like, it's great that I have more mobility, but my other responsibilities and my other connections are more important than an adaptive device. Like, I can live without this adaptive device. I can't live with the knowledge that I just like left my children and my society that I'm trying to create in order to, you know, have this robot suit.
And I'll say again, there was an interesting conversation about this on the Professor X episode of Cerebro, especially because Stephen, who himself had an amputation of his leg through his cancer, had a really good comment that he brought into that conversation. And these are just my thoughts here, but I feel like they're inspired by Stephen's. You know, Xavier does not have a disability justice viewpoint or relationship to his own disability, right? He's not like going to say, oh, I'm disabled and proud. That's not how he thinks about his disability, but he is proud of his mutant identity. And that's something that is an integral part of him. He's not going to go along with the Shi'ar demanding that he give up his mutant identity. That's when he stops and refuses to fall in line.
That and his vision of Gambit's death and thinking about his obligation to his students.
So much of this episode is about
Professor Xavier
thinking and talking about like what is his obligations as a teacher. And Lilandra also pushing like, if you're a good teacher, like why do these adults still need you? Is a interesting conversation. And of course, we're glad he's going back to Earth.
Conversation in light of the idea that it's like if all of the planets that are subject to you are adults, then why do they need you? Like, and Charles actually does, not in the most effective way, but he does get really close to making that statement. It's like, if you've taught them all of your knowledge about how to be a successful society, why can't you now let them go run themselves?
That's great. That's really great. So yeah, let's talk about his lecture, so to speak, his lecture to the class.
Yes.
You know, it's funny because like, as much as everybody is like, oh, you know, Professor Xavier, shut up. Professor Xavier, you're a jerk. Like the way to make people get past that is to have him be in direct conflict with bigger jerks who actually do need to be talked to. But like, how does this particular lecture work? And like, I was especially struck by him putting them in the context of an American school classroom for which they would have no point of reference to. But it's for us. It's for us as the viewer to know what it is for him to know what he's doing by shifting into that mode, right?
Yeah. And what stood out to me watching this is everybody's arguments are kind of spurious and annoying. Like the Shi'ars are incredibly upsetting and oppressive, and Charles's are kind of naive and utopian. But I was looking at them and going like, the number of times I have seen these placed as the exact two possible sides on the internet in like national and international politics. Like as much as I'm sitting here and rolling my eyes and saying neither of these work, like these are often positioned as the two possible sides. And it's to the point where in our notes, there was a specific line that I'll get to, and I will say when it comes, that I said, this is a thing that progressives say, not realizing that the other side's going to dismiss it as bullshit. And you said, no, that's liberals. And I'm like, no, I see progressives doing this all the time. That like, it's so ingrained that he says something. And this is like a nod to Carl Sagan. And I love Carl Sagan. And to me, this is incredibly moving. But the point is that this doesn't work for other people, is the idea that the universe is very old and we are very young. And the idea that the things that we quote unquote know, or the things that like socially, we believe have always been and are the natural order of things, are in fact things that have only been going on for a very short period of time. Like, to me, that's a very compelling statement. But the response that I've seen, and again, this is not actually even moored to like a political position, because it's something that like people who are both very leftist in their politics and quite religious have said to me, is like, you can say that. And then the response is, but I believe what I believe. And to me, this is right. Like saying that, you know, in the grand cosmic things, scheme of things, Christianity is a, you know, dot on the timeline. The response is, yeah, but it's true, is what how people are going to respond to that. So like, as much as it moves to me that like anything that we quote unquote know, you know, we've only known for a very short time, people with strong religious or other sort of universe organizing beliefs are going to say, yeah, but I know I'm right.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually really misinterpreted what your note was.
Yeah.
I took it as the idea that we all aspire to a kind of universal utopian idea in which everyone is the same.
And that is a liberal sticking point. Yeah, that like, I don't see color, I'd like to buy the world of Coke mentality. That is like old liberalism that some people are still stuck on. So yeah, now I see why you and I disagree, because we were reading that line wrong in two different ways. One of which, is a total liberal sticking point that like feels very like centrist. And the other is like just a total, you know, worldview mismatch that a certain kind of person does not get, is absolutely never going to resonate with another certain kind of person.
You're right. And you're right. It's not an effective tactic. So yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, do you think Charles, with what he presented, could have gotten through at all to people? Or because the way the show frames it is kind of like he got through to people, or is beginning to get through to, certainly to like the people who are not intrinsically assholes, i.e., you know, he's not Deathbird herself, perhaps. Do you think he's making any headway with them until he gets distracted?
I think you're right that it's clear that he's making headway with like individuals in the crowd. But the problem with that is, and I think that this is a problem that the show is acknowledging, is even if you convince a lot of people in the crowd, they're not the people in power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is something that, you know, in real world politics, we're seeing over and over. So
yeah, there's a whole system. There's a whole system built around it. But I do enjoy him explaining, like, you are not superior. You're actually doing colonialism. And that was a useful piece of explainer, I think, to fit into the story. I mean, Charles straight up being like, how Rudyard Kipling of you. And then explaining what that means, because like, why would most people have a point of reference for that? I kind of think he needed to give a little bit more of that to be interpreted by most audiences, but you know, I guess the Google exists.
I mean, I feel like the Google exists, although we might need to stop saying that considering how poorly Google works these days.
Oh my God, it's crazy.
But
the
like,
anyway.
But that this is very much like the Google exists, the series, that like, you are not getting all of the references on this show. And one of the things I like about it, and one of the things I like about a lot of recent media that I've thought of as successful, is that they go in with the assumption that I am just going to make some references. You get them or you don't. None of them are going to make or break this so much that it ruins it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I thought it was also just like having them talk about like, what does it mean that this society doesn't value art? He's like, well, except for some art. Right. Exactly. You all make exceptions all the time. That's the only way things function. But what do I also think like when you look at the Kree society, like, and you see obviously Gladiator is not an alien of the same planet as the Shi'ar, but he's a high ranking military official, so to speak. Like, it's sort of a model of colonialism where they are like telling you need to become part of us, but also that like being like, well, can you become part of us? Are you worthy of becoming part of us and being embraced by the center, so to speak? And I think like the fact that mutants are understood to be outsiders even on Earth is like, I think really important to like showing how like no, like that's just not going to work. But yeah, so I thought it was cool. I'm glad that we got, I would have put money on, well, one, I said from the start, Xavier's not dead, but also like she's with Lilandra and Shi'ar's face is like very well set up from the earlier series. So I think it's good that they're not trying to like trick or confuse you. They're like, yes, this is what the story builds towards and this is what you have. I want to jump back a bit. Although, to be honest, it's almost free-floating in my head when exactly this all happens. But let's talk about Trish Tilby, what is up with an in-depth interview with the X-Men at the X-Men's home and all the shit that comes out from that. I love when X-Men do stories where they are involved in media and messaging. I think this is really important and something that I kind of care about in my real life, and therefore I like seeing it on the page. Whether or not someone thinks Beast does a good job of representing where things are at in his conversation with Trish, I think having him place an opening role is very much in line with where he's always been in the series. He's been a spokesperson for mutants. He's like the guy who goes on television and like, tries to affect a professorial demeanor. Right. And, like, that's just like Beast, like actually doing his character there, right?
Hank McCoy remains the only X-Men with media training. That he has always been the one who's able to, one, keep it together and on message, which I think is another thing that puts some fans off about him, that he has a certain level of facade that some of the others don't have.
Yeah.
At the same time, what I love about that scene is that the animator made it so clear that body language wise, he and Trish are making googly eyes at each other, and it's kind of really sweet. So like verbally, they're both staying incredibly on message, and just physically they're like, yes, and things are going to go very differently once the camera stops rolling.
Well, I'm going to put a pin and say, I feel like we have avoided spoilers for the end of the season almost entirely so far. I think where we're about to go now is about to be very spoilery for the end of the season, although still focused on these issues. So just keep that in mind. But how do you read their exchange then knowing that she is one of the people sentinel, a human sentinel or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes really tragic really fast.
But if she's enough of a human supremacist and bigot to join the Sentinels, what are her actual feelings about Hank? Is that something you know?
It's that sort of trope and tendency. And again, if, you go to the wrong subreddit and you see it, that like sort of, I am bigoted towards this because I also want to fuck it.
Oh, thank you for putting that together to me. I had kind of just read it as like, she's manipulating him emotionally this whole time. Cause, like she also has a history of being like that in the comics. It's kind of what I expect. But I like your take on this. I think that brings another level of fucked up that does feel like it really is connected to reality. Like, how dare they be so different and sexy, sexy, sexy? Like, what? But yeah, it made me, when she came out, I'm suspicious of her from the outright because of comic stuff, not based on any particular moment, but it was so predictably hard. Like when she said, like, regardless of your take on current issues, the following scenes are hard to watch. Like the way her newscast prioritizes the emotional needs of the presumed human viewer and like the presumed human viewer, over like telling the truth of a genocide is like, yes, the media is like that. Accurate, very accurate. Good job, television show. But like, it made me so mad, but like not at the show. It made me so mad at like the media universe in which we exist, in which we know that's how a newscaster would preface showing scenes of people being killed.
And in fact, like you could probably do a supercut of newscasters doing that on quote unquote difficult to watch scenes of real life events.
Yeah, definitely. What do we make of her questioning with Scott, who definitely needs more media training before he should be allowed on camera?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons that we should learn from our many years of the X-Men is that Scott should never be allowed to talk to the press under any circumstances.
Yeah, even when he's right, you don't want him saying that. Like, you just don't want him saying
He's
that.
always going to put his foot in his mouth. He's always going to get his feelings and his dick into it. Like, just don't, like, he's a wonderful leader. Have somebody else talk, preferably Hank.
I mean, I'm going to pull up the quote because I actually have this. The thing is, like, of course, we're going to have him say this in the series because it is so emotionally resonant for us, a viewer, which is from, the interview. She's like, why did you lie to me? Which is, I think, like asking people, like, why are they covering up the situation with their child who could be murdered at any second by the fucking hate group is, a very reasonable thing to hide the existence of your child from a hate group in these circumstances. So like, what the fuck? This is private, actually. But Scott's thing is, I said, because you're normal, you're ungrateful. We risk our lives for you. Evil mutants, robots, crazy aliens. I gave him up. I gave him up because you can't say thank you, because I have to stomach your questions and prove that I'm a person. I lie because the truth is we are nothing like you. Thank God, because it's the only reason you people are still alive. It's such a great Scott speech. And does feel very cathartic, even if it is deeply unstrategic to say on air.
Yeah, Scott, get the phrase "you people" out of your vocabulary forever. But yeah, it's like you're watching him spiral, and I feel like the writing and pacing of the show do a really good job of like you see him almost holding it together, and then you see him break, and then from there you're like, how bad is this gonna go?
Yeah. And like in the context of like what just happened in the world, like, well, yeah. And in his personal life, I like how he is constantly thinks he can hide behind the glasses, but it doesn't actually work that way. It just gives him like a couple seconds more time, perhaps. But yeah, like I think this speech really resonates to anybody who feels like they are constantly having their humanity questioned.
Side note, I really do love the moment where like the camera guy is asking him to take off his glasses because they're messing up the light. He's like, I can't. Yeah, no. It's a great little disability moment, and just a great little like moment of levity before things go very wrong.
Yeah, no, it's so, and like that's so people are like, can you take your mask off for this interview? No. Can you take your glasses off? No. Do you have to be seated for this? Yes. Like it's a constant thing. I am now going to jump back and say something I should have said during the Shi'ar bit, which was, we talk about, they talk about statecraft as performance here, and Lilandra saying all ruling is make-believe is, I think, like a good way to continue to play up on the themes from the Genosha scenes with Magneto. And the way, Xavier character, Emperor Charles Xavier, for all the 5 seconds anybody thinks that might happen, talks about the suit itself as being part of the performative jingoism. You have to perform to be able-bodied was like really good, really good. And him also mentioning they are also so horny, like Xavier and Lilandra. He's saying that he's enjoying being her pet. And it's like, yeah, because the fantasy is that maybe he can not be in charge for once in his life. Like that's actually really compelling to him. He has had to be a leader and had to carry those burdens all the time. And one of the things that I think attracts him to her is that he gets to actually let go of being in charge.
Yeah.
Do you think Professor Xavier is a gifted teacher?
So you want me to put on my like education professional hat? I think most representations of teaching and pedagogy in mass media are really, really bad. I think anybody who is being depicted as giving a brilliant lecture is actually doing bad teaching, because most effective teaching is hands-on, interactive and student directed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so if you're going into like, what is your philosophy of effective teaching that's based on research? I'm like, no, he's a terrible teacher. He should shut up and like make this a conversation and, give them hypotheticals that they have to solve collaboratively. That's how you learn to, do political science. Mm-hmm. But like, so, I mean, if you're asking me as an education professional, no, as a moment of like drama and a thing for TV, that brilliant lecture is way more fun to watch than a bunch of people trial and erroring their way through an actually effective, like critical thinking exercise about, political efficacy. So like the answer is no, but what would be good teaching is incompatible with drama.
There's also a question of the proof is in the pudding. Like, how well are the X-Men doing without him there? And I think like we need him back because of this crisis, but do we really? Like, I think that they make some better determinations and judgments than he does. I think it's good to have him in the mix because there is, well, one, like he's going to be the Magneto wrangler because he's got to get his ex-boyfriend. Like he's got to save him basically. Right. But do they need Professor Xavier as a political leader at that moment? Or have they perhaps transcended that? I think maybe he's not actually the political leader that they need anymore.
If he ever was. Like, yeah, I think that like Xavier is right that for himself, he needs to return to Earth.
Yeah.
But that it's more like if he never went back, he could never forgive himself rather than like, because without him, they would be helpless. But I think even he knows that. Like,
yeah,
the damage has already been done. He knows he can't fix it. But he also knows that, and he also probably realizes that like if he had been there, it probably still would have happened. But it's more like he needs to know that he has not abandoned them and that he's done all he can.
I do think overall, though, that the X-Men's urge to appear on a show like Trish Tilby is very understandable, is something that groups like them have to do. And it's just something that they have to do a better job of preparing for and getting on the same page about. Jean deciding that she wasn't in the mental state to have those conversations right then shows real intelligence. She's literally going to be sorting through her memories in the backyard and like, having an emotional moment with Wolverine and not putting herself on camera when she's in that headspace. But I think that some people might question, like, well, why would the X-Men ever do mainstream human media? And I'm like, do you understand? If we remove ourselves, they will cover us anyway, and they will choose somebody else to be a spokesperson. And it will be whoever is going to do the worst job in the world of being it every time. Right. And the discipline it takes to have people go to have other people refer folks to other spokespeople is like real. So yeah.
Yeah. And that's just real life, that one of the most effective things you can do as a public figure is appear on media that is not totally opposed to you, but has some fundamental disagreements with you so that you can communicate your way of thinking to people who are close enough to you to take what you're saying into consideration, but far enough from you that they're uncomfortable with you. Like if you're only speaking to media that's completely on your side, you're just going to alienate everybody else further. You have to cast that.
Well, it's not even that. It's like you're literally not going to be able to reach some people who don't know that they need to hear from you. It's, and it's like why it's like, you don't go on Bill O'Reilly. You don't go on Fox. You do go on CNN. And it's because CNN is probably on in the fucking doctor's office waiting room where people who don't follow politics closely are, being subjected to it. And like, this might be the moment or opportunity where a parent of a mutant child hears from somebody who they are like, oh, here's some other piece of information, way of thinking, point of reference. Or even if it's not at the levels of extremity, it's all sort of like little pieces, little chipping away and bringing more information to people who don't know that they're looking for it, who don't know that they need it. Like, and you're to be in a ubiquitous space. And that's different from going on Bill O'Reilly, who's going to turn your mic off and everybody watching his show is a nutbag.
Totally. And it's the thing too, where it's like, if the New York Times calls up and asks to do an interview with you, regardless of what you think of the New York Times coverage of some topics, you are going to take that call and you're going to do that interview because you know that the reach of that interaction and getting your statements on the record under your own terms is much more important than your differences of opinion with some of their editorial decisions.
Yeah. Somebody else will do it if you don't, and they'll pick someone terrible.
Right. And they'll note that you refuse to speak with them.
Do we want to talk about music from this part of the series at all? Apparently they had an Ace of Base song that's like a deep cut.
Oh my God. It was the music coordination in this series was so bad. I can't even talk about it.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Most people have been really excited about it.
It was distracting. It went on so long. It's more that it was more with the mixing. Like it's something that I'm very sensitive to and that I've learned from some friends that are more knowledgeable than me about it, about like the fine and subtle art of needle drops. That I found all of their needle drops kind of weird and ham-fisted and almost like the sound production didn't sound the same as the other sound. So
no, it definitely sticks out.
From that perspective, it's like, and it's also and I think this might actually be a spoiler for later on, I can't remember, but there's a use of the birds turn.
Oh, okay.
It's the wrong year.
Yeah.
It's just...
I spent a lot of time analyzing that, and we will be talking about that in the finale. But like, I was glad that for once somebody used the deep cut, because if I have to hear their US hit again, I will stab somebody, quite possibly. I really fucking hate that band. But I felt like I have overall liked the music composed for the show. How they're doing things like when Cable's coming, they're like, oh, they're playing Cable's theme from the original series. The way they kind of work different characters into having their own themes and the composition of those themes, I have found to be compelling.
Oh, yeah. The scoring portion of it and the original compositions have been amazing. And that's why it stood out more to me that the use of external pop music like didn't fit with that level of satisfaction for me. And I'm also saying that realizing that my reactions to popular music are often different than other people's. And like things that I find distracting and annoying, other people are going to find really satisfying. So like it didn't work for me, but that doesn't mean it was bad. It just means it didn't work for me. This is something that struck me as very Marvel and very Disney. Is that this thing is full of cameos and Easter eggs and what, again, Disney folks call hidden Mickeys, which is a very specific kind of Easter egg where you're incorporating the logo or like an iconic image that stands for the property into things, often in a way where you can only see it in a freeze frame or from a certain angle. And this refers originally to like things that like, if you look at a very specific frame in a Disney animated movie, you will see the shape of Mickey Mouse. Or if you go to this place at Disney World at a certain time of day, the light will shine through and it will cast the shape of Mickey onto the ground. Like they can be that specific. And I felt like there were some hidden X logos that felt very hidden Mickey to me. So this is sort of an example of like, Disneyfication in a way that at worst is benign and at best is kind of satisfying. So what were some of the Easter eggs or cameos that you noticed that you found really satisfying?
Well, I mean, really turning Morph into the cameo machine is kind of interesting because there's so many times where they turn into somebody who like hasn't appeared in the series in any way. So you're like, wait, how do they know, this character? But like, I think we're supposed to just go along with it and enjoy it for what it is. We are definitely having multiple appearances of Pietro so far, who is my favorite freaking guy. So I was very happy when he used Pietro, Quicksilver's son of Magneto, powers mutating into him briefly. Anytime you can be Spiral. Really doing a cool job showing off, Ilyana Rasputina's magic powers.
I like King Dazzler show up.
Oh, yeah, she literally shows up. I think she might become one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse when they inevitably bring back Gambit as Death or something.
Even littler stuff, like there's a point where baby Nathan has an X logo blankie. There's a flashback of Jean where like little kid Jean is holding like a stuffed toy and it's a Cyclops. So there's lots of cute.
Yeah, that's a bit disturbing. I'm like, why do you have a doll of your future husband? You didn't feel that was a little bit disturbing to have Jean carrying a doll of her future husband?
Well, of course it is, but it's also cute.
Should be a Nightcrawler doll because we know that he manufactures those for all of the women who love him.
It should be a Lockheed.
Oh, yeah, totally. Oh, God, one of the things that really hurt with Genosha was like the Morlocks are all dead. And every time we saw Tommy the Morlock, I was like, it's Tommy. She's the rainbow one who has the ability to be flat. But and it's so heartbreaking. Like, I love that they brought back how important it was to Magneto to particularly look out and watch out for the Morlocks and how heartbroken it is to know that they're basically all dead. Like an entire subgroup of mutant community and mutant culture is gone.
Yeah. Poor Leech and his little hat.
And the thing is, they aren't just treated as they're not just there for the cameo. Like they're there significantly. So, it doesn't feel like it's a shelving or whatever to have had that happen.
Right.
But they are missed. Sarah, where can our listeners keep up with your work and your writing?
So, I have a newsletter that was on hiatus and is coming back, and it's called The Rasher Report, and it is therasherreport.ghost.io, and there will be new issues coming out. I wrote one that was sort of a special about Stephen Atwell, and then I'm sort of retooling, figuring out what's going to go on a weekly basis, and the first one of that new series is prepped to come out within the next week. I'm very active on Blue Sky to a much greater extent than I expected. I'm rasher.bluesky.social there. I post my film reviews on Letterboxd as Padishah, PAS_DECHAT. So that's where to find me.
As for me, I am also on Blue Sky a lot. Frequently talking about music these days. And in fact, I was just on Junk Filter podcast, teaching the North Americans about two-tone ska, as well as probably being one of the first people to explain first wave ska to them in the first place too. But I'd love for folks to go check out that episode on Junk Filter. It's a really excellent pop culture podcast, and I'm so grateful to Jesse for giving me a platform to talk about music that I love, because that is something I don't do on my own show, really. So give that a listen. And then I am on Blue Sky at LEVIN, and looking forward to finishing out covering this season with amazing artist, illustrator, game designer Ethan Gould for the finale, which we'll be recording very soon. If you like this show, please tell someone like it and share it. We've been at it since 2012. And I feel like we've been doing important work at the intersection of comics and movements for social change. So I hope you'll join us. And as we like to say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games. you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.